If you want to write stories your readers will love, there are 3 things you need to do. Understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor and poet, and I have a passion for spy stories, fairy tales, and master detective novels.
And I'm Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for, and about women.
On today's episode, Valerie pitched Sex in the City so that we can study cast design. This 2008 film was directed by Michael Patrick King from a screenplay by Michael Patrick King and based on a newspaper column by Candace Bushnell. Of course, there will be spoilers because we can't talk about the movie without talking about the movie, and there'd actually have to be something to spoil. And please help other writers find our show by leaving a rating and review. For Apple Podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. Simply go to the show's landing page and scroll down to the bottom. It's that simple. All right, Valerie, I'm just going to hand over to you for Sex in the City.
I was expecting you to say, all right, Valerie, explain yourself.
I was going to do that, but I thought that would be unfair.
All right. Listen, I chose Sex in the City because I thought it would be a good example of cast design, obviously. I've seen a couple of the episodes of the show, but not that many. Although everyone kind of knows what Sex in the City is. It's sort of floating out there in the zeitgeist. And I had actually seen this movie before, although I'd forgotten that I'd seen it because it's pretty forgettable. So obviously I knew the basic premise of the show and who the main characters were, but I mean, that's kind of it. And the good news is that it actually is a good example of cast design. The bad news is that there's not much of a story here, and as a result, the movie drags on and on and on and on. Holy macaroni. All right. In addition to being a good example of cast design, it's also an example of conventions. Now, maybe not genre conventions, but franchise conventions. In season 4, we looked at Skyfall, and one of the comments I made then was that it had all the conventions of a James Bond movie. In other words, it had all the conventions of the franchise, and that's a good thing. Fans come to a new story in a franchise with certain expectations, and our job as writers is to meet those expectations. It's just like if you go to a rock concert, right? You want the band to play the hits. Sure, they can add some new stuff, that's not a problem, but you shelled out all that money to hear them play their hits. Likewise, if you're going to a James Bond movie or a Sex in the City movie, you expect to see certain things. So, for Sex in the City, you expect voiceover, lots of fashion, lots of dining scenes, plenty of scenes with all 4 friends together, and you expect each of them to have their own storylines. Although Carrie is obviously the main protagonist, and you expect sex. It is Sex in the City, after all. In season 2, we looked at Death on the Nile, and I spoke extensively about how Kenneth Branagh has ignored the conventions of a Hercule Poirot mystery, and it doesn't work. Worse, it's incredibly irritating for fans of Poirot like me. So gold star to the filmmakers for giving the audience exactly the kinds of things that we expect from the Sex and the City universe. It's a fun world to hang out in. It's a very glossy view, an idealized view of what it is like to be single in New York. But it's not real. It's really not real. These are women who seem to have a never-ending supply of money and free time and social activities and clothes and shoes. This is pure escapism. And if we think back to the work Melanie did on world building, this is a version of New York City that is totally different than the versions we saw in Big or Fatal Attraction or Can You Ever Forgive Me? So that was interesting as well. Here's the same city, but it's presented differently. So that was fun to see. I just would have liked a story, a proper story. This movie does miss many of the basic storytelling principles, and unfortunately, it shows. And that's why the movie drags. And that's the kind of reaction that your reader will have if your book or your screenplay is missing the basics. They won't know that that's the problem. They'll just know that they're bored or that the story seems to drag on. They'll put your book down and they won't pick it back up. It's not their job to know why it isn't working. It's just their job to read it if it's enjoyable to them and put it down if it's not. Alrighty, so cast design. Melanie, as God is my witness, when I chose this movie, I had no idea that there are already dozens of articles and videos examining the four characters and how Charlotte, Miranda, and Samantha are aspects of Carrie's character. I did not know that. The only reason I know about it now is because my daughter told me, and she is a fan of the show. It is a really interesting rabbit hole to go down, though. So if you're interested in this kind of thing, I recommend doing a little Google search and checking out some of the many excellent resources out there. People have really thought about this and done a lot of work on it. My favorite take on it is that Charlotte, Miranda, and Samantha are not real, and that none of the Sex and the City events are real. Instead, they're characters, and the whole lifestyle, in fact, is just a figment of Carrie's imagination, and that her column is actually fictional. And these are the characters that she has created to help her work through the real issues that she's having. That's a fun take on it. And I think if you watch it through that lens, it now suddenly becomes a lot more interesting. Now, whether that was the writer's intention or not, I mean, it's neither here nor there. There is still no denying that Charlotte, Miranda, and Samantha represent aspects of Carrie's character. And as such, they're bringing out different aspects of her. Now, I can't say that Carrie is a dimensional character because she is not. I think she's pretty flat. She is not particularly deep or conflicted. That's not what the Sex and the City franchise is about. It's not. Now, it's easy to jump to the conclusion then that the protagonists in lighter fare stories are flat and they don't have dimension. That's false. Likewise, it's easy to assume that the characters in comedies are flat. That is also false. In my opinion, every character in every story, regardless of genre, should have dimension. Now, yes, there are plenty of examples where the protagonist is flat, and those tend to be plot-driven stories or external genre stories. But that's not to say that every plot-driven story or external genre story has a flat protagonist, not by a long shot. In fact, I have a hypothesis, and here it is, because I love to float my hypotheses. In the past, characters like Ian Fleming's version of James Bond worked because Fleming was writing in a different time to a different audience who were living in a very different world. You and I are writing in 2023. The world is bonkers. We've just dealt with COVID, and many of us are still trying to pull away from that period. Globally, we're searching for meaning, and millions of people are intentionally changing how they live so that they can spend less time in the rat race and more time with the people they love. And more time doing the things that are important to them. And of course, there's AI, which is really messing with our heads. It is very difficult to know what's real and what isn't. Who do we trust? Who don't we trust? Now, the stories that generative AI are producing right now, they're not great. But they're getting better every single day because unlike most of us, they're actually writing. Do you call it writing every day? I mean, those machines are whirring all the time. Most writers I talk to struggle to find some time to write. They struggle to find an hour in their busy day to write. And they might only write 2 or 3 hours for the whole week, if that. Not only does a computer work faster than us, it learns faster than us, it can spend 24/7 cranking out this stuff, right? So even though the stories they're producing right now aren't great, they will be. They will eventually be able to churn out a decent, maybe not innovative, but a decent plot-driven narrative with flat characters that compete with many of the stories that are on the market right now, even big franchises like James Bond. So if your characters are all flat and you're relying on plot twists to make your book a success, I think you might be in trouble. I think AI will overtake you. However, the other side of that coin, the opportunity here is that because AI will never, ever, ever be able to write complex or dimensional characters, if we do, then we have the advantage. And the reason AI will never be able to do that is because it requires an understanding of what it means to be human. AI will never, ever, 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 ever be able to understand what it means to be human. It will always be Pinocchio hoping it can be a real boy someday. It will always be the android Data from Star Trek The Next Generation hoping it can be human. It will never be human. We will always be human. So it's our humanity that's going to give us the edge here. So if we want to have a career in this increasingly competitive world of generative AI and the yet again, new form of publishing, we've got to write stories with complex characters that resonate with readers at a human level. Now, there is something about Sex and the City that tapped into the psyche of its audience. And I think it is the fantasy of that world being real. I think what people love about this is that it's a pure escapism. And if you take it too seriously, it becomes pretty irritating. But if you allow yourself to just get lost in the fantasy, then it can be enjoyable. There is a part of all of us that wishes we had the kind of discretional income that Carrie has. Now, we might not want to spend it on clothes and accessories, but we all have hobbies and passions and things that we would do if we didn't have to worry about, money and paying the bills and feeding the children and all that kind of stuff. I mean, if we want to impose reality on it, Carrie writes for a magazine. Like, how many magazines are there even left anymore to write for, first of all? And for the people who are writing, they're mostly freelancers. And with that one column, they are likely not earning the multi-millions of dollars every year that they would need in order to afford that kind of apartment in that part of Manhattan wearing that level of designer clothes. Right? That's just not how it works. I wish it was, but it is not. It's like the TV show Castle, right? Richard Castle, the character, is an extremely wealthy crime writer whose life is more like a rock star's than a writer's. Yet, he never seems to be writing. It's fantasy. It's the kind of life we wish a writer had. I guess there are some, right? I mean, J.K. Rowling is a billionaire, but even her life is not that. I bet you if we could be a fly on the wall of her office, we would see her at a desk working 8 hours a day. More time doing that and less time hobnobbing with the rich and famous. That kind of life that Carrie lives as a writer is not what most of us are experiencing down here in the trenches, slogging away at our desks, trying to launch our careers. However, it is what we aspire to. All right, so let's go back to the four characters now. And really, whether Charlotte, Miranda, and Samantha are real or not, the conversations that Carrie has with them really is the externalization of her inner thoughts. So Charlotte is emotional, she's romantic, she represents the heart. Both Charlotte and Carrie believe in true love and happily ever after in the very traditional sense, in the contemporary romance novel sense. Carrie's whole object of desire in this movie is to marry big. That's it. Miranda is intellectual. She's rational. She represents the head. Miranda is the independent feminist side of Carrie, and she's the one who tells Carrie not to sell her apartment because if anything goes wrong in the relationship to Big, Carrie will be the one who suffers financially. She'll have nowhere to live. And you know what? Miranda's right. Carrie does end up with nowhere to live, and she has to buy back her old apartment at a much higher price. All because she wanted the fairy tale, and fairy tales are not real. Samantha is confident. She's sexy. She represents the libido. Women have been repressed sexually since the dawn of time, but Samantha is an expression of feminine sexuality that is not in any way repressed. She doesn't put her needs second to that of a man's. She is not there to merely please a man. She's there to please herself, and that's the whole reason she breaks up with Smith. She says outright that she is not the kind of woman who sits at home waiting for her man to return. And the one time she does it, she gets pretty angry. And while she does love him, she acknowledges that she loves herself more. Now, women are trained, we are socially conditioned to be selfless, to put everybody else's needs ahead of our own. In fact, if we do put our needs ahead of our husband's needs, we are shamed. We are seen as not good wives. We are seen as selfish. When Big doesn't show up for the wedding, it's Samantha who stays behind to handle things. Now, why is this? Because Carrie doesn't need her libido at that moment. Her heart is broken, so she needs Charlotte to help her with that. She also needs her head, her intellect, that's Miranda, to help her figure out what to do in that situation. In the shock of being jilted, Carrie's sex drive is gone. In that moment, it is not present at all, and that's why the writers have Samantha be the one to stay behind. That, plus she's independent and strong, but also compassionate. Now we have Big, of course, he represents society, but not just any society. It's the rich white man society. It's the social status that Carrie aspires to. It's when she's in a relationship with him, in her opinion, that she has arrived. Now, they keep breaking up, but they keep getting back together because Carrie needs to be part of that world, that rich, high society, upper crust, elite world. And that's what all this fashion is about, and all this, $300-400 purses. I don't know anyone with a $300 or $400 purse. If I had one, I'd be afraid to use it. It just rains here all the time. The thing would be ruined. Now, there's a scene somewhere in the TV show. It's not in this movie, but it's in the TV show, and Big is describing Carrie's friends. And he says that Charlotte is the brunette, Miranda's the redhead, and Samantha is the one who's trouble. And isn't that the way that the establishment sees a liberated woman? As trouble. Now, this is not new. This has been in stories time and time again. This idea of having a protagonist with 2, 3, 4 supporting cast members who represent aspects of her. In fact, that's what the Wizard of Oz does. It really does. The Woodman, the Tin Woodman, is Dorothy's emotional self. That's the part of her who longs to go home. The lion represents Dorothy's courage as she finds the courage to keep going in the face of all these obstacles and antagonists that she has to face. And the scarecrow represents Dorothy's intellect as she thinks through the situation, as she strategizes and ultimately realizes that she has always had the ability to return home. So, all of this to say that the cast design in Sex and the City isn't unique, not by a long shot. But it works every single time. So it's a great model for how cast design works. However, please remember to give your protagonist dimension. And dimension, as Robert McKee defines it, is a set of conflicting traits. You probably want 3 to 5 sets of conflicting traits for a full-length novel. Probably more than that if you're planning on writing a series. Whew, okay. Melanie, I think that's it for me this week. What do you have to say about conflict or lack thereof?
Well, I've actually, taken the opportunity, I think, this week to look at the problems and how to fix a lack of conflict. Because I haven't really covered off on that this season. So I'm trying to make something good out of a movie that wasn't a great example of conflict. And when I compare Sex and the City to The Gentleman last week, and we talked about there's a flatness of characters across the movies, I think, but the difference in terms of interest in the first viewing between the two movies was like poles apart. So I think The Gentleman, because it had so much conflict, even if it had flat stereotypical characters, was far more interesting to watch than compared to Sex and the City, where there was no conflict, and I found it very difficult to watch. In fact, I even took the iPad into the kitchen with me and baked some brownies while I was watching it the first time, and I don't think I missed very much. But anyway, right. But it's a really good to contrast those two movies.
Melanie?
Yeah.
I have to admit, I was cooking supper when I watched it.
See, it didn't hold either of our attention enough to think.
No. It was the kind of movie I started watching it and I thought, oh, I can get the dinner on while this is on. I'm fine.
And that's what I thought too. I thought, I don't think once I got a sense of what was happening or what, it didn't hold my interest enough for me to go, oh, I can't miss a minute or I won't be able to follow the story. I'm pretty sure I can guess what's going to happen. So there wasn't any tension in it either because there was no conflict and there was no anticipation of what was to come because I think we pretty much knew exactly what was going to happen at the end. So I'm glad it wasn't just me.
No conflict perhaps, but gorgeous clothes, tons of shoes, lots of great dinner scenes.
Yes. Well, I've because it's an older movie now, and I still remember the first time in the tabloid magazines and stuff seeing, like, I think it was a bit of a scoop to see a picture of Carrie in that Vivienne Westwood wedding dress. And I remember at the time thinking, that is one of the most unflattering wedding dresses I've seen in a long time. Like, I did not think that, and now I understand the context of why that was, but I thought of all the things that they could have put that character in, that was not a very flattering or nice wedding dress for her. But now, and that thing in her hair, like the bird. It was the green bird. It was awful. But anyway, I am not a fashionista by any stretch. Yes, I could understand enough about how she got to that point of wearing that dress after I saw the movie. So, mystery solved, I suppose. All right, on to the conflict. So this season, I've been looking at how conflict is created by characters having goals and stakes and also the forces of antagonism. And I really do believe that this is a great formula to help us dig deeper into what happens when a story lacks one or more of these elements. Now, when we studied Little Women a few weeks ago, I did say that the first half of the movie didn't have much conflict. And it was because Jo didn't have an object of desire or a goal at that point in the movie. But as soon as she got a goal and something was at stake for her, the movie became more interesting. And as you can tell, I think Sex and the City, the movie, suffers from a lack of conflict throughout the whole movie and for every character. Now, if there aren't any goals for characters, and then there's nothing for the characters to strive for, and then I really do believe that there's nothing for the reader then to care about or the viewer to care about. So let's just quickly look at the 4 goals for each character. So for Carrie, the main character, our protagonist, she wants to marry Big. Now, he proposes and Carrie gets carried away. He gets nervous and then they don't marry. So that is over, I think, in the first third of the movie. So what does Carrie then want after her public humiliation? And I don't know. I couldn't really work it out with any real certainty or with any confidence that she really wanted anything other than to go home. And then there was Charlotte. So I'm going to break down her wants in the vignette type of scenes that she had. So first of all, she didn't want to get sick in Mexico, and then she got sick and she poops her pants. So I look then at what are the consequences of that? Well, nothing really, other than Carrie laughs for the first time in a couple of weeks. Then Charlotte shifts because she is pregnant again, and she has longed for a baby for a long time. Now, the biggest dilemma for Charlotte at that point is whether she can continue running or not during the pregnancy. Now, okay, that's resolved pretty quickly. She also may have some internal conflict or conflicting opinions when she sees Big at the end of the movie, but then she goes into labor, which is not really a decision because when you're in labor, you kind of, that's it, you're having the baby. All right, then there's Miranda. So she is really unhappy with Steve. She's quite stressed and busy. And then he admits to her that he has a one-night stand with someone, and Miranda and Steve break up. I don't get a sense at any point in time, apart from towards the end, that Miranda wanted to get back with Steve or wanted to bring the family together. And then I thought Miranda's biggest conflict in the movie was the thought of having to admit to Carrie that she was probably the cause of Big's cold feet. And then that was only relevant for about 3 or 4 scenes in the movie. So again, there's not many needs or wants or goals for the characters. And then there's Samantha. And she's unhappy with her life in LA and the lack of sex with Smith because of his work. Now, what she wants is more sex, but she doesn't really get it in the movie at all. And I don't think it's really that compelling. But Samantha, like I said, doesn't get what she wants, but she does get to move back to New York City, which I think is part of her object of desire. But again, it's not really clear because she does spend a lot of time flying back to New York anyway. But then she moves back, so I suppose that's okay. So on the whole, I think the goals and the wants are blah. There are no significant stakes because none of the women really have anything to lose or anything of value to lose if they don't get what they want. And like I said, even Miranda doesn't seem to want to reunite her family until Carrie kind of makes her or gets her to see things in a slightly different light. Now, the problem without a big enough want to carry a whole story is that it results in the characters walking around and bumping into random problems or problems that are short-lived and not part of the story as a whole, which really means there is no story conflict. And without a clearly defined or enduring goal for the story, it is difficult to put obstacles in the way for the characters to overcome. The protagonist's goals or their wants are also really essential to the core conflict of the story, because this is what needs to be resolved one way or the other by the end of the movie. And the core conflict has to be solid for the story to be interesting. Now, this season, as I've mentioned, I'm looking at conflict as a complex blend of wants and needs, stakes, antagonism, and the protagonist's inner struggle. And I've already identified that Carrie doesn't have a solid or enduring want or need in this movie. So, like I said, again, that there's not much then at stake. So I just want to quickly touch on how we work out what's at stake. Well, if we ask what will happen to Carrie if she does get or doesn't get her want, then we suddenly understand what's at stake. So what happens to Carrie when the wedding is called off? Well, she's humiliated, she's heartbroken, she's single, and she's 40. Oh, what a travesty. How bad is that? Yes, that is indeed unpleasant, but her life hasn't ended. Carrie has sold her apartment, but her fabulous executive assistant then arranges for her to buy it back for more than she sold it for. And that's all good, but Carrie is not homeless or has any threat of being homeless. Nor is she in any financial distress. She still has a job, she still has her friends. And this leads me to highlight another issue with conflict, is that the obstacles that are placed in front of Carrie are very weak and easy to overcome, or the story writers have made them easy to overcome. You could make more of some of those obstacles, I think, if you wanted to, but they don't. They just have her step over that hurdle very easily. Now, another example of weak obstacles in this story is when Miranda finally tells Carrie about what she said to Big the night before the wedding. And then Carrie stops speaking to Miranda for a few days, but Miranda rocks up in a taxi in the rain and all is pretty much forgiven. That, and I get it, they're friends, and of course you want your friends around, and of course you want to forgive them. But again, in terms of obstacles, in terms of things that really wrench at Carrie's heart or their friendship, it was very easy to overcome that. And I think that that was a mistake, to make that as easy as it was to get over or to patch things up. The other point I'd like to make when I was watching this in terms of conflict is that Carrie doesn't have a want or a need after the wedding. There is nothing that motivates her, and there is no cause for us to get behind her and cheer her on with. And there is nothing that really drives the story forward. So with no goal in the middle of the movie, it means that the forces of antagonism can't create any obstacles for her to overcome or resolve on her path to achieving what she really wants or needs. Another conflict problem can also originate from only having one goal. Now, again, Carrie only has one goal for the movie, and this means that there is only one clear path for her to get what she wants. And with such a narrow goal and no other viable marriage offers or the sniff of romance anywhere else, there is no tension. There is no anticipation for what's to come at the end of the movie. And I genuinely think that this is the one movie where dramatic irony removes all the tension, because we know what Miranda said and we know that the impact her words had on the wedding, but this leads to only one possible outcome. Miranda must tell Carrie, and Carrie then must go and see Big because she works out what's happened. So the conflict problem of only having one goal leads to only having one choice. And speaking of choices, that's another area to investigate if you think your story lacks conflict. The protagonist must make choices about how to get what they want or achieve what they need. Those choices must force the protagonist to make a best bad choice or make a choice about irreconcilable goods. This creates tension in the character and in the viewer, and there is anticipation about the decision the character will make. And it will also reveal who the character is or what they really stand for. So it does a lot of work by having your characters make difficult choices. Now, the choices don't have to be serious, but they do have to have consequences that lead the characters away from or towards their wants and needs. Now, there are ways to fix a lack of conflict. And one of the methods we saw in No Way Out was by using 3 characters with conflicting objectives in a scene as well as a whole story and moving that around. So if you want to find out more about that, then please go back and listen to our episode on No Way Out. And I do think that The Gentleman, the movie we watched last week or analysed last week, provided a slightly different example of how to fix conflict or how to present conflict in your story. Now, Mickey's want is very clearly stated at the beginning, And then everything in the movie was focused on Mickey getting what he wanted without knowing exactly who was driving the antagonistic forces behind the scenes. Now, the obstacles came from different sources, so this also made the conflict very interesting. And in my opinion, as you can already tell, I found that far more enjoyable than Sex and the City from a conflict point of view. Now, some other ways to create interesting conflict, and these are detailed in Janice Hardy's book, Understanding Conflict, and I'll just quickly list some of these off, is you should make or consider asking the protagonist to go against a personal belief. You can make the protagonist face a choice that they don't want to make. You can force the protagonist to make bad choices. See how decision-making is coming into creating conflict all the time. You can make the protagonist face an impossible choice. You can let the protagonist fail. You can force the protagonist to do something that they'll regret. You can force the protagonist to address an issue that they've been avoiding. And you can also let someone or an obstacle or a force of antagonism actively prevent the protagonist from getting or doing what she wants. Now, ultimately, Sex and the City, I think, suffers because there isn't a core conflict in the story. The biggest takeaway is that you must get the core conflict of your story straight. The core conflict is the main problem at the center of the novel or the movie in this instance. And then you need to make sure that the obstacles and antagonists are trying to stop the protagonist. You force the protagonist into making decisions and then make what's at stake obvious. Sex and the City, I think, also suffers from the same problem as Little Women, where the core of characters are well known and loved, and their stories are also well known, and this makes it difficult for the writers to move away from a formula that fans love. And I think Valerie really touched on that earlier when she was talking about the conventions of that series and meeting those viewers' expectations. Now, the Sex and the City movie, I think, is quite episodic in its structure, and that could be because it's kind of a little bit of a multi-plot story with each of the characters having their own storyline. And this left me with the same feeling of having a vignette style of storytelling, the same sort of feeling I had when I watched Little Women. So from a story perspective, Sex and the City had quite a few problems, but one of the biggest was really a lack of conflict. And if you want to see, I think it's a really good example of what happens when you don't have conflict. I'm really sorry. All right, that's enough said. Valerie, what is the action step for today?
All right,
I'll get hate mail this week.
Yeah, maybe. All part and parcel of the job. All right, so I want everyone to look for other examples of stories with a protagonist and 2 or 3 or 4 supporting characters, and examine how the supporting cast represents aspects of the main character.
All right, well, that wraps it up for this week. Join us again next week when we discuss Love, Simon. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For access to writing templates and worksheets and more than 70 hours of training, subscribe to Valerie's Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/inner circle and follow her on X, Instagram and Threads at Valerie_Francis. If you'd like to get my tips about books to help you read like a writer, visit me on Facebook and Instagram under Melanie Hill Author, or find out more about me at melaniehill.com.au. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.